This disorientation and vertigo that we feel is not an accident. It is a reflection of Trump's narcissistic sociopathy, and ultimately much more important than one man's sociopathy. Because Trump wouldn't be president without the support of the elite. More important than Trump's sociopathy, because it's more important because Trump wouldn't be president without it. It is a strategy of those who wield economic and political power to keep we the people confused, divided, and disempowered. Now, we've talked about in the class about individual psychology, why Trump's narcissistic sociopathy is a foundation for the Trump versus as opposed to the universes, the Trump versus attack on reality. And on his psychological level, Trump does not lie. He believes everything he says. He is compelled to make up the reality that his narcissistic facade requires. And he has claimed immunity from external facts and realities that gives him, and he's claimed immunity from external facts and reality because they're external to him and therefore don't matter. And that gives him the privilege of making up his own reality. He's claimed the privilege psychologically of making up his own reality, and dismissing any reference to a reality that displeases him. So that's the psychological basis in terms of the great leader. I heard a Moth talk that talked about the concept of a bully reality, and that was interesting. It sharpened my understanding of something. He says that the reality of a bully, and he's going back to high school bullies, the reality of the bully requires submission and not belief. Submission and not belief, because it's simply a power play. So if the bully says, your mother's a whore, and you admit it, he doesn't need you to believe that your mother is a whore. He needs to submit to his power. So it's a demonstration. Bully reality is a demonstration of power, and it requires submission and not belief. And that makes sense from the narcissistic point of view, because there is no inner reality and no inner belief. There's also only outward show. So as long as you have the outward show of submission to Trump's reality, that's fine. That's what he needs. And so therefore, we have the experience that agreeing to Trump's reality is a loyalty oath. It's a loyalty oath. Doesn't mean you really believe it. You're just giving fealty to the great leader. And that's visible in Trump's choice of people he appoints to be his cabinet and his secretaries of different departments. That competence, experience, knowledge, any of that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is loyalty to him. So you don't need experts. You don't need researchers of the truth. You don't need training. You just need loyalty to the world of Donald Trump to amount to something in his administration. So joining his delusion about his grandiosity, and you're feeding his grandiosity, and that's what he requires, and it's different from it's separate from any external idea of truth, or internal in terms of the psychology of his followers, truth. We've also talked about in a previous class about fascism being the political expression of the narcissistic paradigm. And famously, Goebbels was the author of the Great Lie, and he's the one who came up with the saying that if you say a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. Now, whether that's an epistemology, he actually thinks it becomes the truth, or whether that's a strategy in terms of dealing with the populace, is probably a fine point. So both narcissism and fascism are based on a polarity. The hallmark of narcissism and fascism is that they're based on a polarity of us good and them bad. And the whole narcissistic paradigm is based on the view that the world is a struggle between irreconcilable opposing interests, and that what we want is victory and dominance of us, the good, and the vanquishing and ideally the extermination of the bad, the other. Now, the way out of that, as is the theme of the course, is that to transition to a world of communion or wholeness or belonging, to a different paradigm, a different way of looking at and living in and institutionalizing our presence in the world. And that view sees polarities as aspects of a greater whole, of a greater underlying unity. Now, we need to and do and cannot help mapping the world in terms of polarities: hot, cold, old, young, whatever. So there's nothing wrong with that as long as we understand that those are poles or aspects or ways of mapping a world that is a unified world. So for instance, a polarity between self and other, that's a necessary polarity, but it's not necessary to say that self and other are at war. But you can see that self and other have a common interest and a common unity that's underlying and that's more important than the polarity between them. Same thing if we talk about separateness and participation. We are all separate individuals, and we all participate. And a healthy situation is where our separateness has room to be expressed and recognized, and we nevertheless participate as members of a whole. And if you're just part of a whole, but you don't have separateness, then that's a mass, and you doesn't have room for a self. And if you just have a self and no whole, then you're just a selfish, isolated atom. So now the great cost of the narcissistic and fascist view of the world is its exceptionalism. The hallmark is its exceptionalism. It's celebrating what makes us separate and better and different and above, at the expense of our belonging, our membership, and our inclusion in the whole. And it expresses itself, and at the expense, so at the exceptionalism, narcissism, exceptionalism, is at the expense of our belonging to each other as fellow human beings, and our belonging to nature and the planet, to the web of life on which we, of course, like everything else, depend. So the cost of our exceptionalism and our disbelonging, the cost of it is violence, abuse, and genocide of other humans, of those humans that we consider other, and violence, abuse, and extermination of a nature that we consider other than us, that we consider ourselves exceptions from. And psychologically, the cost of experiencing ourselves as orphans on the planet and in the universe, the sort of loneliness, isolation, and pain and depression of seeing ourselves as lonesome and unheld and unsupported and unloved by nature and the universe. Now, the costs of this view, of the narcissistic view, are ultimately unsustainable, and we experience them in global warming, in environmental destruction, in species extinction, in genocide, in war, and hatred, and destruction, and increasing power in the hands of the few, and increasing externalizing and disempowerment of the many, and so forth. So in doing that, we're discovering that narcissism, that the narcissistic paradigm, like the psychological needs of an individual sociopath, are a delusion. That the paradigm of separateness and exceptionalism is a delusion, just as the individual grandiosity of a narcissist is a delusion. They're both aspects of the exceptionalist delusion. And it's a delusion because it neglects to recognize our utter dependence on the web of life and our membership in what Native Americans called all our relations. And nature is telling us with increasingly severe consequences that we need to come up with a new way of living on the planet and in the world. That we need to find our proper, respectful belonging within the whole, not exceptions, but members of the whole. So, how do we wake up from the delusion, from the narcissistic delusion, and stand up for the truth? How do we become, we the people, we the ground, we the ordinary people whose life goes on while the princes of power play musical chairs and visit destruction on the planet? How do we, the people, become searchers for and warriors of the truth? How do we stand up for truth amidst the narcissistic denial of a shared reality? Now, I'm going to take a little excursion into epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. How do we have knowledge? How do we know things? And I was a philosophy undergraduate student 400 or so years ago. And I was interested in philosophy. And then at some point, my problems of philosophy were solved to the point where I moved on from that as my primary interest. And I'm going to just trace that quickly. Awful lot of philosophy is a search for truth, for an absolute truth. If we can have one absolute truth, then we can deduce everything from there. If we have one absolute truth on which we can hang our hat, we can deduce everything from there. We have that sort of starting point. And a lot of philosophy has been the search for that. And the search for that is, one version of that is idealism, which is Plato and Kant, where they're saying, well, what's really true amidst all of the perceptions and all of the ambiguities of life, what's really, the one thing that's really immutably true is the categories of the forms in Plato's term, or the categories in Kant's term, the categories of our mind. And it's idealism because our mind, our way of perception, those principles of how we perceive are eternal, and everything else is in flux. So that's what's real. That's the one thing that's really true. That's idealism, because it says our ideas are what's true. Our internal perceptual structure is what's true. And the other side of that polarity is imperialism, which says that reality is outside of our perception. And the confusions that we have about, in this ambiguity and subjectivity we have, is due to confusions in our way of knowing reality. But reality is objective and solid and real. And we're always in the process of trying our best with all our confusion to understand the objective external reality. So so the polarity is our internal way of perceiving in idealism and objective external reality in empiricism. So that you can see that that's a dualism in which you choose one side of experience and hang your hat on it. So the healing of that delusion, which was presented to me by some wonderful teachers, is existential phenomenology. And if you want existential phenomenology, and one of the main writers of that is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, MERLEAU-PONTI. And he wrote his main book, or his basic book, is The Phenomenology of Perception. But you can look him up. But what he says is, our starting point, we don't know objective reality aside from our ability to perceive it, and we don't know our perceptual apparatus aside from the world that we perceive with it. So the irreducible primacy is perception. We can't get any realer or deeper or underneath our perception. Our perception is the primary irreducible unit of our knowledge. And our perception is always a relationship between our way of perceiving and what we perceive. So that's a healing. It's a relationship of the two poles, the outside world and our perceptive apparatus. And we have no access to an external reality free of our perceptions. That's one side. We have no access to an external reality, objective reality, free of our perceptions. All you have to do is take a walk with your dog and know that the dog lives in an entirely different world, and a world largely of odors and stuff. Or just imagine the world of a bat who echolocates. They're living in an entirely different objective external world. Same world, presumably. But their access to it is through their perceptive apparatus, and it's different from ours. So you have no access to an objective reality outside, except as perceived by the human perceptive apparatus, and you experience the human perceptive apparatus only but there may be contemplative ways of experiencing it, but really you only experience it in relationship to the external world, the feeling that there is an external world. There is something other. There's something that we are perceiving. There's an object to our subject. So our exceptions and our experience, therefore, is always shaped by our intentions, our points of view, our interests, and our assumptions, what we bring to it. So I remember from, again, 400 years ago, he talks about you walking through the woods and there's a log lying there. Well, if you're just trying to get through the woods, the log is an obstacle. If you're trying to make a fire, the log is fuel. If you're studying the ecology of the forest, the log is a home for ants and plants and falling apart and making soil. So your interest, your point of view is always involved in your perceptions. So your basic perceptions are always shaped by your perceptions, your interests, intentions, assumptions. But your individual assumptions are always shaped by the goals and interests and questions posed by and beliefs posed by the culture that you're in. It's always culturally shaped, not determined, but shaped. So, does that mean we're saying there's no reality? Every truth is equal? There's no truth? No. Truth is accessible by the accumulated shared experience of our culture. So we have a consensual reality from the shared experience of our culture. The paradigm of your culture is made up of the questions, the truths, the assumptions, the goals that make up the truth. In a paradigm, the truths, assumptions, and goals and that make up a paradigm is formed of the truths, historically accumulated truths, assumptions, beliefs, needs, desires that make up the consensual reality of a culture. So a culture has a consensual reality, right? And it used to be for us, it was Walter Cronkite of our generation, Walter Cronkite, my generation. What he said was basically true. And if he said that the Kennedy assassination was an individual act and had no political power behind it, then that was true, and every other idea was silly. And when he said the Vietnam War was a fight against communism and for freedom, then that's what it was. And when he finally came around and said, we'll lose, when he turned against the war, then we turned against the war. So there was a consensual reality, and that has the advantage that you're oriented, and the disadvantage that, of course, every consensual reality has its blind spots. So that's what we've been calling a paradigm, is a cultural worldview. And cultural worldviews get tested by history, get tested by the human species cultural experience living in that paradigm. And in that paradigm, and shaped by what is revealed by that paradigm and what is understood by that paradigm, but also by what is hidden and the blind spots in the way in the way that we perceive and understand and act in the world, in keeping with the consensual reality of a particular paradigm. So there is a test of truth. It's not just whatever you believe, because every paradigm has a price and gets tested in the world, gets tested by history in the world. So the test of the truth of a worldview and the perceptions it supports and the perceptions it obstructs is the test of it. The proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is our historical experience on the planet, our lived experience on the planet. Ultimately, it's whether that worldview is compatible with living in the world. whether that conventional reality is compatible with living in the world, whether it reveals enough and hides little enough that we can function successfully in the world. Now, how do we reorient ourselves? How do we as a species and as a culture reorient ourselves when we need to build a transition to a new consensual reality, a new way of understanding the world? Now, we have been birthing that in various countercultural movements since the get-go. And those new ways of seeing and understanding and living in reality have been ongoingly in the process of developing and birthing themselves as we live still within the dominance of the current narcissistic paradigm. So the question for us is, how do we transition and reorient ourselves when we need to build a transition to a new consensual reality that is compatible with the ongoing life of the planet? How do we find a consensual reality and a consensual set of truths and way of understanding the world that's compatible with the ongoing life of the planet?